first-round draft picks in the NFL at quarterback fail, and particularly at 1 and 2 overall. When you look at Jared Goff and Carson Wentz, there have been 25 drafted with top 15 picks in the last 10 years. And just in that group alone, the only ones that you can really argue have made it are Andrew Luck, who stepped aside, and Ryan Tannehill, who's now in Tennessee. The others are all on new contracts somewhere else or have only been in the league a year or 2 or 3.
Welcome back here to Birds 365. Mac guys, John McMullen, Jody McDonald. We got a solid 35 minutes left with you here today. Our next guest, I know it seems this way, but I will absolutely guarantee to you that it is not a requirement that you have better hair on your chin than you do on the rest of your dome, although it almost always seems to work out that way with us. Joining us here on Birds 365 is the executive editor of Pro Football Weekly, contributor on Westwood One's coverage of the National Football League, and NFL insider for The Score in Chicago. Hub Arkush jumped aboard with us on Birds 365. How was your Memorial Day weekend, Hub?
Very good. How you guys doing?
Doing well, Hub. Since you're based in Chicago, let's start there with you. And obviously the Bears have been a story for Justin Fields and obviously moving up in the draft. The whole process as a whole with Ryan Pace as a general manager, a lot of people from the outside looking in project him as being on the hot seat, maybe Matt Nagy being on the hot seat. How did that factor into this decision to go quarterback in the first round of the draft?
John, it certainly would suggest that Ryan Pace and Matt Nagy may be the only two guys who don't think they're on the hot seat. You trade future first-round picks and then using the pick that you get on a guy who's not likely to see the field at least on opening day. And if they have their way, not a whole lot this year, they don't sound like guys who are in a win-now mode. Now, you flip that around a little bit, you got to realize the 3 years they've been together in Chicago, they're 29 and 21. They've been to the playoffs twice. They haven't had a losing season. And so, you begin to scratch your head a little bit and wonder, as some of these other coaches and regimes, survive for 5, 6, 7, 8 years, how these guys could be on the hot seat. But it's because of the quarterback position. It's because of the trade 4 years ago that Ryan Pace made to get Mitch Trubisky. And, first taking him and missing on him when Deshaun Watson and Patrick Mahomes are there is bad enough. But he traded up the one spot. He gave away 2 3s and a 4. He really put his reputation on the line. He's the one who joined himself and Mitch at the hip. And so I think that's why you hear so much of this. But Bears ownership more interested about where they're at now. So they're not in great shape. They have to be competitive this year. But I don't think that seat is nearly as hot as a lot of people believe.
We do know that they gave Andy Dalton a pretty good amount of money to come in and be their QB1. And he's Andy Dalton. He's had a solid NFL career, but never been spectacular. Did get a chance to play for the Cowboys last year when Dak goes down. He had his own injury issues, did Dalton. For me, he is what he is, and he's not great, but he's not bad either. What is going to be the determining factor as to the timetable of the quarterbacks in Chicago? Is Dalton more likely to keep the job through 3/4 of the season, kind of like what we saw last year here in Philadelphia? We know the reason Carson Wentz was replaced because he stunk, not because they were dying to get Jalen Hurts on the field. I got to believe in Chicago, at least part of the fan base and the front office want to see Jalen Hurts, Justin Fields on the field year one. How's it all going to shake out? How's it going to be decided there this year?
Well, there's a lot of fans and even media here in town who think Fields should start the opener regardless. Doesn't matter about anything else, but obviously that's not the real world in the NFL. Again, this is a team, albeit a 500 team, that was in the playoffs last year and, has a winning record the last few years. It's an aging team. They're middle-aged right now. They're not old. But this may be their last year to really make a run with the rest of this roster if some of the other changes they've made have worked. And then you got to remember that Matt Nagy was the offensive coordinator in Kansas City for the entire rookie season that Patrick Mahomes sent on the bench. He started that 17th week because they wanted to rest Alex Smith for the playoffs. And so Matt has told us that there is a a plan. There is a desire to do it a certain way, and that they're continuing to develop that. But, people in Philly know it better than most. They've also got the best backup quarterback in the NFL sitting there, and Nick Foles behind Dalton. I am not personally a Dalton fan. I laugh when they talk about the 3 Pro Bowls. All were as an alternate with numbers that get other quarterbacks cut, So, I mean, he's a game manager is what he is. And he did a great job of managing games in Cincinnati with a really good roster around him. That's how they got to the playoffs 5 years in a row. He was hurt that 5th year, but the first 4, the reason they lost them all is because that's all he was a game manager. And when it stepped up in the playoffs, then they didn't have what they needed at the quarterback position. So he is there as a bridge to Justin Fields. What we've started talking about now is, well, but what if Dalton gets hurt early? Then what do you do? My suspicion is they probably go to Nick Foles if he's still here. The problem with Foles is the Bears have got big cap issues, and they can't release him. It costs too much against the cap. If they could trade him, they could make it work. So it'll be interesting to see what happens there. But assuming all 3 of them are here, I got to believe Justin Fields is number 3 right now, not number 2, as everybody's trying to figure out how quickly they get him on the field.
Bob, you are on in Philadelphia, so I do want to rewind to a couple things. One, there's a report out with Nick Foles, but we'll get to that in a second. I want to take you before the move to Justin Fields and when Carson Wentz was on the market. The 2 teams, at least nationally, most focused on were Indianapolis and Chicago. How interested were the Bears in Carson Wentz?
Well, I think it's pretty obvious at this point the reasons that it was Indianapolis and Chicago, because you had such strong Philadelphia connections in both places, and both teams had real veteran quarterback needs. The Bears were definitely interested in Carson Wentz, but my understanding from my sources there is that what happened is that they knew at the end of the season they were done with Mitch, and really nobody has been able to get to the bottom of that yet. But my sense is that Mitch Trubisky was as done with the Bears as they were with him, and that's why there was really no effort whatsoever to bring him. I mean, when you look at what he signed for in Buffalo, it's kind of pitiful. The idea that because Brian Daboll had a good year with Josh Allen, that he's going to go there and have the same experience. Not sitting on the bench, he's not. So it was really surprising that there wasn't a bigger market for him. But at any rate, you knew that there'd be new quarterbacks coming in. They wanted a quarterback of the future. I think around the league, the consensus is that Carson Wentz, everybody gets the problems in Philly. This is not a guy you give up on yet. And so was he going to be less expensive than what it took to get one of these first-round quarterbacks who almost always fail? Jody and I have talked about this. I've written about this 3 or 4 times over the last 7-8 years. First-round draft picks in the NFL at quarterback fail. And particularly at 1 and 2 overall, when you look at Jared Goff and Carson Wentz, there have been 25 drafted with top 15 picks in the last 10 years. And just in that group alone, the only ones that you can really argue have made it are Andrew Luck, who stepped aside, and Ryan Tannehill, who's now in Tennessee. The others are all on new contracts somewhere else or have only been in the league a year or 2 or 3. So Carson Wentz was very appealing to the Bears, but at a set price, and then we heard what Indianapolis paid for him. A lot of people in Chicago were surprised the Bears didn't offer more, but that tells you there were some concerns there. The one thing that Pace does is he keeps things pretty close to the vest. And my understanding is that of the 5 who went in the first round this year, the only one they would have traded up, obviously Trevor Lawrence, the only other one they would have traded up for was Justin Fields.
They had Fields highly rated, as did I. I think they got a heck of a player, at least value-wise, in the draft for where they got him. I think he will not be one of those first-round busts that you alluded to. I think the kid's got a ton of talent. I think the Bears did quite well in getting him, but right, only time will tell. John kind of alluded to this. There was a report out there that's just got more play over the last couple of days from Tyler Dunn, an NFL insider, pretty well-respected reporter, that said that Nick Foles was actually offered to the Philadelphia Eagles at some point. We don't know, at least as per the report that we've been able to see, the time frame of this isn't quite pinned downable. That he was offered to the Eagles, and that according to this report, Nick Foles didn't want to come back to Philadelphia. We know the timing of it is key, but we don't quite know the timing. If you've got more insight to this, when or if there were conversation, was it actually in the Carson Wentz potential trade conversations that Chicago and Philadelphia had? When, if you do know, Hub, when was there conversations between Chicago and Philadelphia about a return trip to Philly for Nick Foles?
Well, Jody, my understanding is that Foles probably would have been part of any trade package for Nick Foles, for Carson Wentz. And so, right leading up until the Colts made the deal, again, I believe that there was at least 5 teams involved after the initial, hey, what would it take stage? And then the other 3 dropped off fairly quick, and it was down to the Bears and the Colts. But I think up until the point where the Eagles realized that they were going to get apparently a better offer from the Colts, and also the desire to trade him out of the NFC. We have to keep in mind when you make a deal like this, you always want to move to the other conference if you can, and certainly out of your division. So probably right up until about the time, Wentz became a Colt is when the Bears had Nick on the table.
Hub, you talked a little bit about those quarterbacks in the first round. I do want to circle back to Justin Fields and the fact that Minnesota evidently tried to trade up in the division. Does that stoke sort of that interdivision rivalry and force maybe a little bit of an overreach? You talked about Trubisky. Part of the reason you not only got it wrong, you traded up when you didn't need to trade up. And now we're talking about Justin Fields, who I agree with Jody, by the way. I think he's a good prospect. But if it goes wrong and you gave up a lot of capital again, there's no way Ryan Pace can survive that. Am I wrong thinking that?
No, John, that's spot on. And it may even be that if Justin Fields doesn't play this year, which is their want, and they don't get back to the playoffs, so they have a losing record. And so let's say he doesn't go until, week 12, week 14, something like that, he could be out without even getting to see the kid play. So from George McCaskey, who is the chairman of the team, there's basically still 9 McCaskey children along with Virginia, God bless her. But George is the boss. They believe as long as the team is competitive and going in the right direction, that they're not making any changes. And that's the 100-year history of this ownership group. That's not just this time around. So, making the trade at this point, it was trying to make the team better. See, this is where I keep coming back to, guys. I know a lot of teams in the NFL could have this story. The Bears go 12-4-18 first year with Nagy and Pace together. They come back the next year 8-8. But they literally were 3 plays in 2 games from being 10-6. And so now it's not a bad follow-up year. And then this year you get back to the same story with the 6-game losing streak and the way they lost some of those games. I mean, week 5, they beat up the eventual champion Tampa Bay Buccaneers. And so it's not a bad football team. It's not a team that is going nowhere. And McCaskey ownership family is so patient at times that I think that's one of the reasons that he doesn't have the heat that many think. But listen, we talk all the time. Is a young GM going to get a chance to hire his second head coach? Well, Matt's already done that. He had the first 3 years with John Fox. So certainly this is a pivotal year. And this is, if they're not great, if they're competitive because of the defense again, turns out Fields isn't going to be the answer at quarterback, but they're still winning, it may not be enough. I would think this trade and being competitive the rest of the way is the deal for Ryan Pace.
Will the Bears be facing off twice this year against the Aaron Rodgers-led Green Bay Packers or the Jordan Love-led Green Bay Packers?
Well, that's funny because when you mentioned Tyler's name, he's the one who wrote the original Aaron Rodgers War and Peace memoir that basically cost Mike McCarthy his job. Listen, the whole thing makes no sense to me. Clearly it's Rodgers who has planted all this, started all this, made sure we're all talking about it. He started doing it, in his press conference following the loss to the Bucs in the title game. If we are to believe the reports that he doesn't understand why they're coming out, that he is telling people he will not play for Brian Gutekunst again, then it'll be without Aaron Rodgers, because the 2 things the Packers aren't doing is they're not trading Aaron Rodgers and they're not firing Brian Gutekunst. And so at some point, Rodgers has to speak publicly, with more than a little, joking session with Kenny Mayne and say this is what's on his mind. Because realistically, guys, we know he's very unhappy. We know there's a problem between him and the GM. But beyond that, we don't know what the answers are. The Packers have been trying to make him the highest paid player in football for the last 6 months. They've been talking about that contract. So a lot of people say it's money. We'll give him whatever money it takes, if he's going to be a good soldier. This gets back to Aaron Rodgers being one of the all-time greats on the field and one of the all-time great prima donnas off the field. And this shouldn't have happened. He's the reigning MVP. They were in the NFC title game. He clearly caused this. So trying to predict what he's going to do next has become really difficult.
Hub, this is sort of a bit of a theme around the NFL. I don't know if you want to call it more of an NBA-like mentality where players have a little bit more power to steer things in the direction they want to go. We heard rumblings about Russell Wilson. That's kind of settled down. Deshaun Watson, obviously, before the legal issues, Aaron. Now Julio Jones basically says he wants out of Atlanta. It looks like he's going to be out of Atlanta. Has this shifted dramatically, and is this a problem for the league?
John, I think it's going to be if they allow it to be. Here in Chicago, obviously, we've always been a little Bulls crazy. I don't really watch the NBA much anymore last year or two, and it doesn't have much to do with COVID. This whole idea of a few superstar players dictating the entire league and building their own super teams. Now, I realize, I may not be their target customer, but it certainly has turned me off. And so, I just to think about what is going to happen in the NFL, it works for some. There's no question about that. But even with Julio Jones, it's not that he's over the hill, but on the backside of your career, it's one thing. It's really these three quarterbacks: first Watson, and then Wilson, and then Rodgers, and now with Watson. Listen, the kid is innocent until he's proven guilty, but it is a little strange timing, that nobody understood what he was so unhappy about, and then these other stories started to break, and you have to wonder if he didn't have ulterior motives for wanting to get out of Houston. Russell Wilson, to this day, has never said he wants to leave Seattle. That all came from his agent. The list of teams came from his agent. Rodgers is the one trying to pull this right now. The last guy really to do it successfully was Brett Favre, if you think about it. So it certainly is not epidemic in the way that the NBA is, but it is a concern. Look at some of the youngsters. I still don't understand why the Dolphins traded Minka Fitzpatrick to the Steelers or Jamal Adams. Now that the Seattle Seahawks paid a king's ransom for Jamal Adams, and it looks like it was a pretty good deal. But at least that one made a little bit more sense because the Jets knew they were rebuilding anyway. But for the most part, I don't see it, taking off the way it did in the NBA. I think this hard salary cap is the great equalizer in a lot of ways.
All right, Hub, let's say 20 minutes from now, after you sign off here with us on Birds 365, your phone rings, and it's Arthur Blank, who says, I saw you on Birds 365, and that Jody McDonald guy was right. You've got your finger on the pulse of the league. Tell me, truthfully, Hub, I don't want you to mince words here. Give me the honest skinny. What is Julio Jones's value on the open market? What can the Falcons get? What should they be asking for? Or what should they settle for?
Jody, and this is, I'm not reporting this. I just, as I talked to folks around the league, I had this gut feeling when I say I'm not reporting it, and nobody told me it was going to happen, that the Patriots were going to give them that 15th pick in the draft for Julio Jones, and that they were then going to turn around and use that 4th pick on a quarterback and come back at 15 and address the pass rush or the offensive line. There have been reports since the draft that multiple teams put a 1 on the table. I don't believe that because I think the deal would be done already if they had. You can announce the deal and have it be a post-June 1 designation for cap reasons anyway. And actually, we're at June 1. I almost forgot. They can all happen today and tomorrow.
Right.
So I think a contending team right now, a team that knew they were going to be in the playoffs. So now you're talking about a pick in the mid-20s to the back of the first round. That 1 could still be in play. But I got a hunch it could turn out to be a pair of 2s or a 2 and a 3, something like that. His production hasn't dropped off when he's been healthy, but he has had a lot of these nagging injuries that come with age the last couple of years. And so, Julio Jones is still one of the top 8-9 receivers in the league, and maybe higher than that if he's healthy.
You mentioned the age, and Julio is 32. And, one of the cliches in this league is you don't pay age. So, how difficult is it for the Atlanta Falcons when you have somebody going on, national television, whether you knew it or not, with Shannon Sharp saying, "I'm out of here"? How difficult does that make it for a team to get value for a player that has some issues, even though he's a future Hall of Famer, even though he produces, because this league is obsessed with that number 30, and he's 32, and he did have nagging hamstring issues. How difficult does it make it for the Falcons to make the deal?
Well, it's certainly it basically, it's not that it makes the deal difficult, John. It's now where you start to question what's the price. How much can you get? I mean, Julio is not a problem child. There's no issues off the field. He's been a team leader. He's been a great professional. As Jody said, he's a first ballot Hall of Famer. So I think the measure is just how much is left. And that's why, we're going to remember Randy Moss, who is in the Hall of Fame, had the best year of his career in his mid-30s in New England after everybody thought for sure he was done because he'd gone to Oakland and flamed out. And Julio Jones, has been a more consistent presence is what I want to say. I'm impressed by Randy Moss. When he, young in his career, I thought he'd be another wide receiver diva who talked his way out of the league by year 4, year 5, but he actually became more mature and more of an adult the longer he was around the league. And so, but Julio Jones, a solid citizen from day one, a huge producer, again, when healthy, a matchup nightmare. I don't think they've got no shortage of trade partners, I guess is what I'm trying to say. Who can they milk the most out of? And you got a rookie GM and Terry Fontenot trying to pull the strings. And so that could be one of the reasons this could take a little bit longer too. When you are a rookie and you haven't done this before, you're going to be a little bit more careful when you make that deal.
All right, Hub, last one for me. As a guy who's been around the league and has seen the changes over the last couple of decades, I need your thought process on this. Miraculously, this offseason, even though it was done individually by the 32 teams, or so reported, almost to a team, they all decided that mandatory offseason stuff was going to stop, and all this optional team workouts were not only going to take place, but take place and have pretty damn good attendance, as a matter of fact. So it is a different landscape we're dealing with during the off season. Will we be able to see that in the first month, 2 months of the upcoming season, the quality of play? What they decided between the union and the teams collectively to come up with as to how much work they're getting in here in the month of June as compared to what happened in previous years with mandatory workouts. Will we actually see a different level of quality of play?
I think we will, Jody. It was obvious early last year. A lot of us were surprised that they were even being able to play at all, and that they'd had no preparation in the form that they're used to. They will have more this year. I think the question now is how much more. It's kind of scattershot all across the league as to what they're doing. A lot of this is the Players Association pounding itself on the chest and trying to get concessions in a 10-year CBA they never should have signed in the first place, and barely did, by the way. It passed by 59 votes or something like that, with over 2,000 players voting. And they're trying to sell this idea that off-season work is somehow more dangerous and causes injuries, which is ridiculous. The whole point of it is to reduce injuries. When you play, it's going to happen, but the Players Association hasn't been able to get much for their guys finance-wise, healthcare-wise, other things. So they talk about making them work less. At the end of the day, that's kind of what it comes down to. But then you have to, plug in what we were all going through last summer. Everybody was, certainly not paralyzed, but handicapped by not knowing what was going to come next. Really by week 4, week 5, week 6, as we began to see, first of all, they'd had games now as opposed to a full preseason in practice, but also began to settle into the routine. What we don't know right now, and I think the reason after the Players Association said a lot of these guys weren't going to show that they did start to show, really 2 reasons. One is Juwan James happened, and the Denver Broncos pulled a $10 million contract on him. And it makes no sense from the Players Association perspective. Obviously, these guys are safer and better off working with their own team trainers in their own team facilities, if for no other reason, because of all the protocols from coronavirus, which is where I'm going next.
Yeah.
It's moving fast now, guys. We don't want to take it away from the Eagles or football and get into areas where I have no expertise whatsoever. But as we all look around us, we can see that this recovery has really picked up pace in the last couple of weeks, with mask mandates going away and positives coming down and everybody getting vaccinated. And so I think, that's the reason that players are more comfortable being in there right now, but we don't know where we're going to be in 30 days, 60 days if we continue with this recovery. If things continue to get better, then yes, I think you'll see much better play early in the season this year.
Hub, you mentioned the union. J.C. Treader, one of his main arguments was, hey, look, last year we had nothing. We showed up and the product was as good as it's ever been. You've been covering this league for a long time. Aesthetically, is the product on the field as good as it's ever been?
Well, John, you guys, cover the Eagles, focus on the NFC East or least. You tell me how good the product is.
That's where I was going.
Yeah, and part of it is that some of those teams were doing some rebuilding, but you can't argue that the first, 4, 5, 6 weeks of the season last year were the equal of what we had come to expect in the years leading up to it. Now, it did catch up again. By mid-season, second half of the season, once everybody got used to the protocols. So overall, the NFL is better than it's ever been, was in 19 heading into 20. I think the fact that they pulled off the 20 season the way they did tells you something about the NFL, because I never thought they'd get past week 2 or week 3, with what we were dealing with COVID. So the product is fantastic, but the argument that they want to use what happened last year as evidence as to what should come, that's just ridiculous. Maybe one of the reasons that injuries were done is because of the number of players who opted out and didn't even try and play. Obviously, there's no connection there. But you can't use anything that happened last year as an example to the bigger picture and where the league was at going into it and where we hope it's going to be coming out of it as we get back to more normalcy in everything we do, not just the NFL.
He's been one of the best in the business for the last 2 decades, and we were lucky to get him on with us today. Hub Arkush, thank you very much. We will certainly reach back to you again before the season gets underway. Thanks for hopping on with us. Glad to hear you had a good Memorial Day weekend.
Thank you. Same to you. Everybody stay safe and stay healthy out there.
That is Hub Arkush, editor of Pro Football Weekly, here with us on Birds 365. All right, Johnny Mac coming back. We'll put a bow on the show on a Tuesday edition of Birds 365.
If you missed any of today's show on the JAKIB Media channel, listen to the podcast on your way home. Available on YouTube, Apple, and Spotify.